Hatred at a terrifying level in a conflict that risks sliding from forgotten to ignored. 1 year after a coup in Central African Republic, what has been done to help resolve the crisis? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. The talk is of savagery and brutality, bloody and murderous violence, and ethnic cleansing. It's been a year now since a mostly Muslim rebel coalition staged a coup in Central African Republic and a campaign of looting and killing that followed, one that prompted a violent backlash from Christian militias. Thousands of people have died and there are warnings of a humanitarian catastrophe. We'll speak to our guests in a moment, but first Tanya Page in the capital Bangui helps set up our discussion.
A white sheet covers another body dumped on the streets of the capital Bangui. These people may have seen what happened, but no one's talking. French and African Union soldiers have slowed the cycle of violence, but blood is still being spilled. In Muslim areas, property has been ransacked and burned. The mostly Muslim Seleka fighters that seized power a year ago are weaker but haven't evaporated. Anti-Balaka Christian militia are taking revenge for atrocities committed by the Seleka. But they don't differentiate between fighters and civilians, so some take precautions when they come to pray.
We live in fear. We are prisoners in our district. We can only stay in our neighborhood. When we try to go out, they shoot us.
Tens of thousands of Muslims have left in panic, scenes that have been repeated so many times, the United Nations is warning of a dramatic shift in demographics.
There isn't a fully functioning military, police or judicial system, so attacks are being carried out with impunity. These people need help, but it has to come from the outside, and so far there just aren't enough troops here to secure the country.
Central African Republic is one of the world's poorest countries. It has a weak interim government, but for some the international response has been inadequate, even unwelcome. He says they're sick of it. The French, Seleka, Chadians and AU forces should go away. Seleka fighters shredded Horacio Legrand's arm when they shot him. It will heal in time, but he's not sure his country will.
Our country has lost too much. Too many have died. There's no leadership, so I really don't know what will happen.
The funeral prayer where the Muslim or Christian is recited too often. Many wish they could go back to the way it was and live happily side by side. But wherever there is fear and anger of this magnitude, there is death. And the longer it continues, the harder it will be to end. Tanya Page, Al Jazeera, Bangui, Central African Republic.
Now, to give some added perspective, this is what the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, told a news conference during her mission to Central African Republic just last week. She said the intercommunal hatred remains at a terrifying level, as evidenced by the extraordinarily vicious nature of the killings. This has become a country where people are not just killed, they are tortured, mutilated, burned and dismembered. People apprehended with blood on their machetes and severed body parts in their hands have been allowed to go free because there is nowhere to detain them and no means to charge them with the crimes they have clearly committed. Let's bring in our guests now. In Paris, Florent Geel, Africa Desk Director at the International Federation for Human Rights, and who was in Central African Republic just last month. Joining us from our London studios is James Schneider, editor of the online magazine Think Africa Press. And also in the French capital, we have Keumayou, president of the Pan-African Press Association. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on Inside Story. Florent, tell us about the ongoing situation on the ground as far as the violence is concerned and what it is that you saw when you were there.
As your reportage show it, I mean, mass killings, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and a total impunity and the violence still going on, even with the presence of the international forces there, that just contains this violence to a certain level of violence. But in many areas you have still killings, rapes, sexual violence, and we saw that almost 18 enclaves regroup around 15,000, 20,000 maybe Muslim under threat and under attack of anti-Balaka. You have to remember also that the country is cutting in two pieces, and we have very few information about what is occurring under the Seleka occupation on the east of the country, but we know
and
that
that's in the mainly northern part of the
1
country,
now,
isn't it? I mean, how much of a fighting force is still left there?
Absolutely. We are waiting for at least 10,000 of international forces when the UN peacekeeping mission will be on the ground. But to control clearly the situation, maybe 2 or 3 more will be needed.
James Schneider, the level of brutality that Florent was raising as well, it's been quite extraordinary, isn't it? The hacking to death of people, the cutting of heads. What do you put that down to?
It is absolutely horrifying, the level and the manner of the violence. But I think we need to look at what some of the drivers of this violence are, and we need to be looking at hunger. So the UN says that something like 90% of the population are only having 1 meal a day, which is a large driver of violence. It's also partly the reason, not the main reason, but partly the reason why violence has been targeted at Muslims in the capital Bangui, because they were mainly the shopkeepers, and when there's such high levels of hunger and there's such large levels of looting rife, they tend to target those who have shops, who have food, and that was the Muslim population.
Do you think that's also behind the fact that most of those who are targeted are not the fighters themselves, but the civilians, because they are easy targets, and most of the weaponry that we're seeing around is not that sophisticated, is it?
No, it's not, and that's one of the really cruel ironies, is that the Muslim population who've mainly been targeted in the northwest and west of the country and in the capital Bangui are really rather different from most of the rebels from the Seleka Alliance, who are mainly from the northeast of the country. So the civilians are doubly unfairly targeted. Of course, no one should ever be attacked in the way in which they've been attacked, but they've been attacked not really for they don't actually have objective links to the rebels.
Louis, how would you define what is going on? There's talk of ethnic cleansing. What do you put it down to?
Well, the fact is that from the beginning we have been confusing we've been making some mistakes concerning the real situation on the field. It's not a confessional problem going on in Central African Republic. A former president of the Ivory Coast said, you can't share poverty. You can share prosperity, but not poverty. During almost 50 years, the northern and the western parts of Central African Republic were abandoned by Bangui, because Bangui is the heart of the country, and everything is done in Bangui. And remember, when the rebels of the Seleka started to get into the town, into Bangui, President Bozizé said, it is jihadist, it is Muslims. Our enemy is clearly called Muslims. And that's how everything started. They were not living in the Central African Republic as if there were a community of Muslims and a community of other people. They were living as a nation. And remember,
okay, let's talk a little bit more. Sorry, excuse me jumping in there, Louis, about the fallout of this. According to the UN, the entire western half of Central African Republic has been cleansed of Muslims. The capital, Bangui alone, has seen its Muslim population drop from around 130,000 to under 1,000. The UN says the fighting has created a humanitarian crisis, forcing many people to live without shelter, food or healthcare. Almost 1 million people are displaced within Central African Republic or seeking safety in neighbouring Chad and Cameroon. That's nearly a quarter of the population.
The people who have been affected by the crisis here in Central African Republic are not only being forgotten, they are now being ignored. And we cannot allow children to go hungry. We cannot miss the planting season while the world ignores the people of CAR.
Florent, tell us about the humanitarian crisis, or what's been predicted as a humanitarian crisis, and what is being experienced on a day-to-day basis.
You have to understand that it's the first time that you saw such crisis in Central Africa. Most of the people, especially in the area outside of Bangui, are displaced, and they are outside of the house. So it's a huge mass, and people are joining each other to be safer, and a lot of people and population flee to the forest and to protect themselves because their houses have been burned, etc. But you have to keep in mind that all this aspect, all this conflict, it's political. It's to catch and to get the power or to keep it. And that's why the dynamic today of the religious conflict is not really an ethnical cleaning, but really a political and religious cleaning that show that the actor of violence on the ground have some strategy, and attacking the population, persecuting the population, it's part of this strategy, and it's producing a humanitarian catastrophe as now, and with a very clear and political purpose to attack some population. And each actors of this violence have their own objective attacking the population. That's why the conflict is so murder and it's so trash today, including this exodus of people that remember us bad histories and bad memories, like in Rwanda or in Bosnia, or where people were under attack in this kind of enclaves.
So the hatred, you're saying, is linked to political motivation. James, the impact of that obviously is this growing humanitarian crisis. People are being pushed into the bush. How are they surviving it? Is it possible, if there's so much politics at play, to get the humanitarian needs to those people?
Well, it's very difficult for two reasons. Firstly, the lack of security is making the provision of humanitarian relief very difficult. The UN was forced to fly in aid from Cameroon to the capital Bangui rather than truck it by road because there was fears that the truck drivers would be attacked. But secondly, there's enormous funding gap to support the humanitarian relief effort. And World Food Programme and the other frontline humanitarian relief organisations that are picking up the slack on this are hugely underfunded for their Central African campaigns.
Louis, do you think the humanitarian teams have let the country down? Do you feel that there's the appropriate desire to make this happen?
No, the fact is that the humanitarian issue is now an old issue. It is also an urgent issue now, but it is lasting since now almost 40 years in certain parts of the country. And this urgency, we'll find it also in other neighboring countries like Chad, DRC or Cameroon, because they are receiving lots of people fleeing from Central African Republic. But those people are not only foreigners. There are lots of Central African Republic citizens fleeing from their countries because they are insecure in their country.
So it's also making those situations in the neighboring countries a lot worse.
It is sometimes worse because they arrive there, they have no relatives, they have the people can be trying to care about them, but they don't have enough means to do it in a comfortable way. So it is really a big issue. But what I wanted to mention also to relieve is that if we don't pay attention to what is going on in Central African Republic, it is not a peacekeeping operation. It is order. It is keeping order in the country. It is a police operation, not a military operation. And if we persist in trying to bring a military solution to what is a governance or simply an economic issue will probably get wrong till the end.
Okay, let's talk more about the peacekeepers, because we are seeing a growing number of peacekeepers being sent to Central African Republic, but as yet they have been unable to stop the downward spiral of violence. France has so far committed 2,000 troops. There are some 6,000 troops in the African Union's peacekeeping mission known as MISCA, which translates as International Support Mission in the Central African Republic. The European Union has contributed 1,000 troops. The UN has now proposed a 12,000 strong force. That would have a more robust mandate with an initial focus on protecting civilians. But even given the urgency, it could be up to 6 months before they are on the ground. 6 months, James, I mean, that seems extraordinary knowing how dire the situation is, that it's going to take that long. What's the problem there?
The problem is lack of support and lack of political will when there's so many other situations going on in the country, and it's an enormous problem, because as the other contributors in your report from Bongi said, the real problem, or one of the really big problems, is a lack of accountability, impunity, and no police force or viable prison or court system, which means that people can attack one another with no regard and with no comeback. So this UN force needs to happen much faster, and its policing component needs to be very robust.
Yes, are you suggesting that the mandate needs to be changed? Because, you know, as Navi Pillay was saying, and you were confirming, that people are walking down the streets with severed heads and nobody is apprehending them. Do they need to be given more rights, the UN peacekeeping force?
When the UN peacekeeping force comes, it will have a policing element, it will have a policing contingent, so it will do that. But this is a crisis which has been going on at an extreme level for some months now, and the UN, or the countries which make up the UN, the most powerful countries, should have been active on this for quite some time. There was a thought, an assumption that France would be able to do what it did in Mali with relatively few troop numbers, relatively on the cheap, and the situation is just much worse and much more complicated, and they need to play catch up really quickly.
And Florent, those who are there at the moment, I mean, many of them are not adequately trained. Much of them are spooked. We saw an incident on Friday where some of the forces fired into a crowd. That can only be alienating these peacekeeping forces from the community as well.
Yeah, that's why the UN peacekeeping mission have to bring. It's a little bit more cooperation, coherence, and also this civil part of this peacekeeping mission. That's mean to bring up the country, to rebuild totally the Central African institution, and especially the justice, because as Jane was explaining, the impunity and the accountability is the first problem. You can do a lot with this aspect. First, you can arrest people and actors of the violence, of the current violence, and secondly, you can show to the people that the state is coming back. But for that, you need some prison, you need a legal chain that we call, that means to arrest people, to put it in jail, to bring them before an independent judge, etc. That's why we propose also to the Central African Republic to rebuild an urgent unit in justice, like a task force for justice, to be able to arrest people, to judge them for the crime that they have committed, and afterwards and to have more comprehensive and much more bigger investigation on the responsible of the most important and the most serious crimes that have been committed in CARE since now.
Okay.
Maybe 10 years, because one of the main things in CARE is the continuation of the impunity since 10 and 15 years.
I mean, Louis, you really wonder how many people need to die in this conflict. I mean, it's been a year on since the coup. It shares an ominous anniversary with Rwanda, 20 years on. but you wonder what it's going to take. How many dead people do there have to be before real action is taken?
It's really a pity that such a lot of people are getting dead, and no one is thinking about the way we can be securing the others who are living there. We are seeing them getting killed, getting displaced from where they live. And I think the first answer we should bring is the situation is very difficult for all the population, but the fact is that the state has simply fall apart. There is no state in the Central African Republic now, and the urgency is to rebuild it, to make sure children can go to school again, to make sure people can be starting a business again in the country. And when I say business, it is also the informal trading of people sending products of first necessity in the country. Because if the situation is so urgent now, it is because nothing is going on and nothing is showing that the state is
any
still
signs of hope.
Sure.
Okay, Louis. Now, we heard just now about the concerns that the crisis in Central African Republic will be ignored. Here's more of what the UN Human Rights Chief, Navi Pillay, has been saying. She said, "I cannot help thinking that if the Central African Republic were not a poor country hidden away in the heart of Africa, the terrible events that have taken place and continue to take place would have stimulated a far stronger and more dynamic reaction by the outside world." James, is that the problem? Is it just a poor African country that really doesn't serve much to the outside world?
Well, in ordinary or in supposedly ordinary times, the Central African Republic doesn't get very much coverage, and it should do. The baseline health indicator levels from about 3 years ago, Médecins Sans Frontières brought out a report, and it was already at an emergency level, and this is in a non-conflict period. The Central African Republic is not a kind of strategically important country for most of the international community, and therefore, the stories that come out of there tend to be very few foreign journalists who are there. So yes, it is something that gets left off the agenda.
Florent, do you think it's just been overtaken by other events, Syria, for example, and the fact that it's likely to be a forgotten event?
Yeah, care have always been forgotten in the countries, in the conflicts. The last conflict there is 10 years ago, we were investigated on, and we had to push all the international community to intervene, and for the international criminal court to open an investigation on the Central African Republic. And with a lack of justice in Central Africa, this new crisis and the new war occurred also. That means that maybe it's a time for the international community to be there, to be present, and to respond to the urgency. And I think it's really important, including because in all the area, in South Sudan, in Chad, in Darfur, the crises are still present, and now it's not just a national challenge, but a regional challenge to avoid and to bring more stability in this part of Africa.
And obviously to bring back some hope. Louis, any signs of hope in the country?
Well, what I want to mention also is that don't forget about the fact the former president, François Bozizé, is not far away from Central African Republic now. He's now based somewhere between Uganda and Southern Sudan. So he's not far away. His son is still in the country and helping a lot those new militias, anti-Balaka. So if we just think we will be securing the frontiers of Central African Republic and don't pay attention to those who are helping those anti-Balaka, I mean the Lord Resistance Army in Uganda, for example, if we don't pay attention to those issues and consider only the current station in Central African Republic, for sure we are going to miss something very important.
Okay, let's leave it there. A big subject. Thank you very much for talking us through it. Let's make sure it's not forgotten. Florent Geel, Louis Keumayou in Paris, and James Schneider in London. And of course, you can find this program and many more on our website. Just follow the links for shows and Inside Story. I'm Jane Dutton. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.